So hi everyone. Giovanni and I decided that I should make a second appearance to this module, at least. I've been very busy, so I apologize for not being here teaching you guys all this semester. But I have to admit that Giovanni did a better job than I have so far. I was looking at his feedback from you guys, and he has scored better than I have last year. So I think they should fire me and actually employ Giovanni for next year. So okay, today we're going to talk about a topic that most of you have heard in the media, which is about this huge challenge, which is trying to understand between two types of models of computations and trying to understand if these model of computations are actually similar or not. And but the general, topic, the general umbrella of this topic is actually called computational complexity. And before diving into that particular question, let's look at some of the details that underpin this theory. So I won't go into much detail mathematics, but just to give you, a general flavor of what this entails. So complexity theory provides, great insight into, structure of, data, so observations. So we try to understand randomness, and all the theory that comes out of this, we try to understand efficiency and computations in general. So computation complexity is actually divided into two subtopics called the Kolmogorov complexity and the computational resources space-time measures. So Kolmogorov complexity is something that is actually related to what you've been doing here in this module, which is given a data set that is like a streamline that is being given to you, you want to understand what is the language embedded within it. That is at the heart of all fundamental science. That is, we want to find invariances within a data stream. So once you understand the regularity and the data stream within it, then you can express it with a formula or mathematical statement. So you actually decode, so to speak, nature. Okay? And so this is really at the heart of, every science, and the idea of Kolmogorov complexity is what is the smallest code or representation of that observation that you're actually looking at. Now, you've seen these classes of computation models from regular languages up until the Turing paradigm, universal Turing machine. And the smallest possible within this world is called, as you now know, the regular languages, right? So if I've got a bucket of symbols then thrown to you, then you should be able to start from that smallest possible language, and then you evolve until you find what is the actual computations out there. So some people even believe that the whole world, the whole universe, is actually computable. That is, there is some, so if I basically analyze all this data set, I measure everything, at some point I will derive the mathematical statement that actually simulates this whole system. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. That's for you to judge. So an example here, for instance, is this Mandelbrot fractal. If you look, this is a very complex data, and to actually represent this guy, you actually need 1.62 million bits, right? So storing that in a computer is a really, it wastes a lot of space. Then the question is there a mathematical representation that if I look at this data, I can actually represent it? And if you have it, then you actually come up with a very small code that is also only a few bits, and then you can actually run it and generate this data set, right? And the question also applies in general to everything that we do in science. That is, you measure, and then you want to find, an invariance within that data set. Okay? And that's what you've been looking at, so to speak. Okay, you haven't gone into much detail, but the topic is actually called Kolmogorov complexity. So we won't look into that, because it's actually very technical. So we'll just skip that. In this class, what we're going to look at is what is known as computational resources. That is, we're interested, so we know that now there are two classes of big classes. Say there's the problems that can be solved. These are the halting problems. So you can, on a finite time, you can actually decide if this is actually will have a result or not. But there's also problems that are completely undecidable. But for these kind of systems that we want to understand is we want to find ways to better implement code. That is, we want to find ways to take all these decidable problems and try to find measures whereby then you can quantify the speed and space taken by your, say, algorithm, and then perhaps even improve your code. So the questions that emerge from here is like, what is feasible computation? That is, what kinds of computations that you know about, but if they actually take a lifetime, say centuries or millions of years, then that would not deem as that is not deemed as a feasible computation. So then what you want to do is find reasonable ways or to use the computational resources in an intelligent way. Okay. So again, so as I said, so typically we consider only the computable functions, that is the ones that you can actually code on a Turing machine, and we know that is decidable. And now what we want to do is actually input into the system and run. So what we want to take a set of data set, so a set of data of different sizes up to n, and then you run the system, and then you want to measure both the time consumed and the space used on that particular system. So you want to find reasonable measures for that. And now it depends on the level of abstraction that you actually want to define these measures. So for instance, if you're looking at a high level of abstraction, say for instance if you're coding in Java or so forth, so sometimes you might consider that the input set, the size, is actually related to the level of description of the abstraction that you have. But typically what we're interested actually is looking at the level of a Turing, so that is the size of the input tape. So everything, so all the symbols that are within that system. But anyway, the two are correlated in some sense. Okay. So okay. So now you've seen there are two types of computations. One is called the deterministic computation, and the other one non-deterministic computation. So you've seen. So to measure this time and space, what we're going to use is the notion of configuration that you've seen before. So what is a configuration? Just a reminder. Remember that the configuration of a Turing machine is that you've got the configuration, the tape configuration. So that would be, for instance, Ci, and that's the information within the tape. And you'll have a particular state at that particular moment, and the head of the machine will be at a particular, say, cell of this machine. So that's actually one possible configuration. And as the machine runs through the algorithm, so the system will always change from configuration to configurations. So a linear computation or deterministic computation, basically you start off with the one configuration, and for every transition, you have a time step, and you move to the next configuration, and so on until you get to the halting state. So what we define as the running time is simply the number of steps taken to actually run all these configurations until a halting. And then the space measures basically is only those cells that the machine has actually visited in this running time, within this running time. Okay? So that's a general statement. And for the non-deterministic machine, this is also another model of computation, but it's not really if you try to map this, the two possible closest non-deterministic machines are if you're considering a parallel computation. So you've got different machines running in parallel. So what happens is that you start off with choices, and then you can branch off into sub-process, and all these run in different, say, parallel computers. Another way, another physical system is the quantum mechanics, using the quantum mechanics paradigm, where again, at the physical state, we use the physical properties of matter, And then there, again, you can actually branch off into several solutions, into several configurations, and then you run these in parallel. Okay? So now, for a non-deterministic machine, the running time that we consider is simply the shortest branch that leads to halting. So this one might actually lead to halt, so say accept, and this one leads to a reject, but basically the shortest path. So you can have different halts. So all these actually leads to, say, halting, right? Because we're just interested in halting problems. So then what we choose is really the shortest branch that leads to the accepting state. And again, the same definition applies for the space use. That is, you will just want to actually count the cells that have been visited all through for the shortest branch in this particular case. So you can see that once you have this shortest branch, if you just look at this subset, it actually looks like actually a deterministic machine, right? So this actually will represent the same. So it's as if that you can already see that one is a subset of the other. Okay. So now, but we need a formal way to quantify this, and this is due to Landau. Emmanuel Landau is a French mathematician that invented a notation that is typically used in computer science to measure, and this is what is known as the big O notation. Okay, and what you consider. So let's go actually straight into the graph just to get a better intuition of what's going on. So forget what's there. This is very mathematical, but you don't really need to go into detail about that. But suppose that you've got a Turing machine or an algorithm that you've coded, and now you want to quantify this time. So what you do is you actually run this machine for different inputs. So size, say, input size 1, 2, 3, up until, say, huge n. Okay? So you've got infinitely many inputs. You actually run this machine, and then what you're going to do is measure according to these configurations that we just defined, and you're going to measure the time it took to run. And what you observe over all these runs, over all these inputs, then you trace out a function that looks like this guy here. And this function here might define, say, the algorithm's time or the memory taken. It depends on what you're actually measuring. And what we're interested is asymptotic values. That is, you want to find a function that for large n, it will bound this guy, this function that you actually come up. So you'll find a function gn that bounds this function. So after it saturates, then you can actually find a function that bounds this guy. So once you find that function that bounds, then what you're saying is that this function is of order, so this time step, or the memory used, is of order gn. Okay? So that's, you're just interested in asymptotic values in some sense. Okay? Let's just look at, say, one example. So suppose sometimes you can actually look at your algorithms and quantify the running time, say, let's just focus on the running time for now, and you might get a very nasty function that looks like what is there, right? Now, for large n, so for inputs with, say, very huge input strings, then what happens is that these terms there, the other terms will actually become very small, so you can neglect them, and the only terms that survive is this big guy here. And on top of that, we don't care really about the, say, these constants. So now you can say that your function, so your time step of your algorithm, is simply of order n cubed. So that is, you run your system for different n's, and it might behave very erratically, but at some point you can actually find a function that is cubed, that then basically bounds this measurement that you're doing. So what I don't want to, so what one does not want to see is, for instance, suppose you've got a system that you say, okay, my algorithm runs on order n cubed. Okay. So what you're saying is that, okay, if I have, say, an input, say you've got an input of size 10, this is an input tape. So then what you're saying is that your time step will be of order 100, right? 100 configuration times that. So what you don't want to say is that, okay, you don't want to run your system, you don't want to test it just for one input, but you want to test it for very large input, because it could be the case that if you run for, say, an input tape of size 11, then it could take, say, a time step of million steps, right? Say 1 million. And this is no longer order O cubed, right? So this is what you don't want. So it's a measure that is not really applying for single input, but is actually as asymptotic value, trying to understand for a large n what happens to your measurements. So this is the big O notation, just for you to. Okay, so different classes. There are different classes of algorithms, as we see, and basically what you have is that you've got here again problem size. This applies both to, say, either space or time. So you might have so there's a curve that is linear that divides between very small growth, typically logarithm n, and then up this linear scale. What you have is that you've got polynomial time algorithms and exponential time algorithms, and you've got this subclass which is n times log n. Okay, that's the picture that I want to have for you to have, and then let's try to understand what happens to these classes of computations. Suppose you've quantified and you've come up with these measures. So suppose you've got an algorithm. So here I'm plotting, say, polynomial time algorithm that goes from n all the way to n to the power 5, and then here I've got exponential time algorithms, and here basically I'm just increasing the number, so the size of the input, so from 10, 20, 30 up until 60. And now I'm going to quantify the running time of this algorithm, and immediately you see that there's a striking difference between polynomial time algorithms and exponential time algorithms. So for instance, if you run, say, a polynomial time algorithm on an input of size 60, basically it takes seconds to run, or minutes at most. But now, if you actually run an exponential time algorithm, if you run on an input size 60, it might take centuries, right? And these are really considered not to be feasible computations. So what you want to do is, once you identify that kind of pattern in your algorithm, you say, look, is there a way to actually change my class of computations from what is actually regarded as exponential time algorithms all the way to this class of algorithms, okay? And why is this important? Again, there's always a debate, there's always cost involved. So on one hand, yes, you could say, okay, who cares? I mean, I can basically, if I come up with a very fast hardware, then that solves my problem, I don't care. And that's not really true. So on one hand, you've got new machines that cost quite a lot. Say, for instance, nowadays there's a huge funding going into developing quantum computers, as you know. There's a lot of money, and so far we have not been, so successful, because there's problems about stability within it. So it's costing a lot of money. Indeed, if we come up with a quantum computer, then you could solve potentially a lot of problems, but which problems? Even with quantum computers, there are problems that it will still stay exponential. That's the sad part. And yes, you've heard about Moore's law, but even under Moore's law, what we know, there's a theorem in this particular subject that actually have revealed that even within using quantum computers, so if you have a polynomial time algorithms, you still remain within polynomial algorithms. That is, yes, you could reduce the coefficient of the polynomial time algorithms. So for instance, you might have very high coefficient algorithms, but with a new machine, you can actually bring down to, say, another order, but you can't actually say, for instance, if you have exponential, you can actually traverse this boundary. So if you stay in exponential, you stay within exponential. And if you stay within polynomial, you stay within polynomial. And that's really the sad news. That means then the computer scientist who's developing a code has to really think, how can I improve my code to actually cross these boundaries? Okay? And that's really the part here. So brain power is much better, well, to some extent, than just the hardware. So you have to think, this costs less, but it's possible to really traverse these boundaries. Okay? But of course, there are certain algorithms that really escape, all possibilities, and they just remain so complicated that it just remains exponential. Okay? So again, so the classes are, so what is known as this bull's-eye diagram. So it's just a hierarchy of telling all these complexities. So you have these polynomial time algorithms all the way up until the exponential time, and this actually grows to more complicated diagrams. So here I just put a subset of it, and these are what is known as containment algorithms. So what I'm saying here, more or less, we'll see this in detail, is that everything that a polynomial algorithm can do, this class can do, right? Or this class can do, and so on. So these are just really containment algorithms. But what do they mean actually? So sorry here that I can't, I'm not being able to show the whole thing. This is actually slightly shifted somehow. But anyway, so what is P here? P, so these are polynomial time algorithms. These are the set of languages or algorithms decidable in polynomial time on a deterministic Turing machine. So you've got a linear computation that goes from configuration to configuration, and once you measure your time, the time taken in this algorithm, then it will lie within a polynomial time algorithm. And these problems are typically, as I say, here solved in polynomial time. So you want to quantify, and then it will stay there in polynomial time. NP problems, these are the set of languages decidable in polynomial time, but on a non-deterministic Turing machine. So this could be running on a parallel processor, or for instance on a quantum computer. So that's the measure that you decide that you're quantifying on. But this level of complexity is actually more complicated than these guys. Why? Because these problems are actually not efficiently solved. These problems actually typically take exponential time. If you were to convert these algorithms to a polynomial, say to run on a deterministic machine, it basically incurs an exponential time. Okay? But once you understand what is the solution of the system, you can actually check it in polynomial time, as we will see an example just to clarify these notions. And then obviously, then you've got polynomial space and exponential time. Okay? So before we go forward, just to bring to your attention, most of you might have heard as well, you've got software profilers out there. So once you've coded an algorithm, then you can actually try to see where basically you're incurring, say, time in your algorithm. So it comes up with different measures saying, say, which part of your code is actually taking a lot of time or is actually using a lot of space. And then it's up to you to use your intelligence to improve the algorithm, okay? In order to try to bring these times lower down. However, these codes that exist out there, these time software profilers, don't give you the measure, the O notation, which is much more important. And that comes from only the analysis that the programmer does. This guy that just basically does say, the analysis for a particular data set, but not for, say, large data sets. Anyway, they're quite useful anyway. So now let's go back and try to understand this diagram, the relationship between these containment relations. So, because if you go back again to our definition, it's quite easy to see. So let's go back again to our definition of, say, between a deterministic and a non-deterministic computation. And by looking at the definition between the two, we can see that this guy is simply a subset of this non-deterministic machine. So once you have a solution, so a branch basically looks like a deterministic machine. So basically, it's easy to see that NP is a superset of the P algorithm, as it says here. So by definition of, say, our measure, we know that NP is a superset of P. So everything that, say, P can do, then the NP can do as well. But now there's a controversy here, but we'll look at this towards the end. There's a video that I want to show you. It's actually on YouTube, so I couldn't actually run it here directly, but let's try. We'll go through YouTube. And they do a very good job at explaining what is going on between this kind of stuff. So we'll try to look at this better. But in principle, what we know so far is that we know that P is contained or equal to NP. But this equality here is up for grabs. And there's a lot of money involved to understand if there's some kind of equality between these two algorithms. And we'll try to understand that. Okay? So let's just look at an example of what is a P problem, so polynomial time example. So an example of a polynomial algorithm is the following here, and you guys use quite a lot in Google Maps, which is given a directed graph G and two nodes ST. What you want to do is find a path from these two, from one node to the other. An example here, I'm given a graph with certain type of nodes, and an example here is there a path from 7 to 4, say from this guy all the way to here. Now it turns out to be that if you actually code this guy with, say, a marking algorithm, which is quite efficient, that is, you start off, say, with this node here, so you mark this guy, and that's the end node that you want to reach. So you start with this guy, and then what you do is just look at the directed edges from coming out from this node. So from this guy, so you've marked 7, that's your initial state, and from this guy you go all the way to 8, so you mark 8. And from 7 you go all the way to 10, you also mark 10. Once you mark this, you go to those marked nodes and you continue the same procedure. You look at all the edges that come out from 8 and you mark again, and as well for this guy you mark again, and so on. And you move forward in this marking process, an iterative process. And you do so until you possibly reach 4 or not. And if you come up with the algorithm that actually divides that, then you'll see that when you quantify, it turns out to be that this marking algorithm actually takes polynomial time, so n squared, where the n here, again, n is the number of nodes. So you see here the level of abstraction that I'm using. I'm using at this level, I'm just using nodes instead of the, say, the symbols in a Turing machine. So it just depends on what level of abstraction that you're using, but one correlates with the other. So it's not so important. So this is an example of a polynomial time algorithm that runs in order n squared. So it's reasonable. That's why you have Google Maps and you use it every day. Okay? But an example of an NP algorithm is something slightly different to this one, which is called the Hamiltonian problem. That is, again, you're given a directed graph G and two nodes S and T, and what you want to do is find a path from S and T, but that visits all nodes exactly once. In particular, if S and T are the same, then what you want to do is find a closed loop on that graph. But you can only visit one node all the time, so just one node. You can't visit, say, twice a particular node. So in this particular case, the solution is if you start from 1, you can see that there is a solution here that you go from 1, 3, 5, 4, 2, 6, and 8. Well, 6, 7, and 8. So you visited all the nodes, and that forms what is known as the Hamiltonian path. Now, this problem is much more complicated than the other, and it turns out to be that this is an NP problem. Why? Because in this kind of algorithm, what you have to do is actually compute all possible, say, paths in this. So you actually generate a tree, just like what we saw before, how non-deterministic machine computes. So you have to generate all possible paths, and then you have to verify. So for instance, here, an example is you generate all these path possibilities, and then, so the generation of all these paths take exponential time, but once you have a particular path, you can test if this actually forms a Hamiltonian path. As in this case, this actually forms a solution, and then you can see that indeed is an Hamiltonian path. So again, a non-deterministic polynomial algorithm takes exponential time because the generation of all possibilities is huge. The space of search is huge. But once you get the solution, it actually takes polynomial time to actually verify that indeed that forms a particular solution. And here you can see that the space of solution is really huge, because here you've got 8 nodes. For 8 nodes, so it's a graph of 8 nodes. 8 nodes. That means that the possibilities that you have here for paths, all these possible paths that you have here, is actually 8 factorial. That is 8 times 7 times 6 times 5 times 3 times 2 times 1. So this is a huge number of search space that you actually have to do. Okay? So if you have a bigger graph, say 20 nodes, it's actually 20 factorial. And that becomes, as you can see, depending on the input size that you have, the search space just becomes very huge. It's just a minor, it's really, it's a problem that's quite similar to the other, but just with a new constraint, you immediately change the nature of the problem. Okay? And this is an NP problem. Another example of NP problem is the Hanoi Tower disk. I know I'm sure you know about this algorithm. So this game, again, to solve this problem, again, you have to do searches, and the search space is huge, right? So it really takes exponential time to actually solve this in, say, a deterministic fashion, and the search space is huge. So for instance, if you have, but once you find a solution, it's easy to check that indeed the solution, so all this branch, so this is actually a branch. If I follow this branch, this is actually a branch of system, and then I can know that this actually takes, for say 3 disks, I know that 3 to the power 3, it takes 8 steps. But say if you start the same system but with 20 disks, the steps increases dramatically. And actually not only the steps, so what I'm counting here is actually the steps taken. So I start here with a deterministic machine, and I've got, say, something like that, okay? And for 3 disks, I know that this thing here is, as in there here, for 2 to the power 3, it goes to 8 steps. Yeah? But the whole of this generation of tree is exponential time. Okay? So it really, you can see that we need to find an intelligent way to actually transform these algorithms without searching, but actually finding a solution in a very reasonable time. Otherwise, for big systems, for large inputs, then this just explodes. Okay? So now, let's go back to relate to what you've been doing so far, which is trying to understand the time complexity of regular languages and context-free languages. Okay? So, if you look at it, the minimal that you can expect in an algorithm is actually linear time, right? And this makes sense. For regular languages, which is the minimal and the smallest level of computation, is actually linear, and this is quite trivial, because, as it says here, for regular languages, a finite state automata, so you have an input, and the finite state automata will have, for every single input that it reads, it will have a transition until it accepts or rejects the particular input. So basically it will scan, so as it has a transition, it will scan one input at a time until it finishes. So the number of transitions is the same as the number of inputs that you have. So you see that there's directly a linear relationship between, say, the inputs and the transitions of a finite state automata. So the minimum machine, so the minimum algorithm that you can find, really, in terms, is n linear. And from there, so if someone tells you, oh, I've come up with an algorithm that is below linear, log n, then there's something fishy, what he's saying, right? So you have to analyze. Now, it's possible for space for space-time, it's possible to have below linear, as we will see later. But for time, it starts from the linear upward. So let's look at one example of context-free language, and let's try to quantify the time taken by this algorithm. So let's consider. So you've seen this with Giovanni a number of times. The language that basically has strings that have equal number of zeros followed by equal numbers of, say, 1. You've seen this before. And let's try to come up with an algorithm, in this case a very naive algorithm that I have here, and let's try to quantify. But let's assume that we are coding this thing in a Turing machine, just to make it such that we have a pseudocode and that is easy to understand. Okay? And now what we want to do is pass the string of this, and to understand if this string belongs to this particular context-free language. So a very naive algorithm is, so you have this input that is entered into the system in the Turing machine that is placed there, and then the first step to this algorithm is, for instance, check if the string is in this form, 0, 0 asterisk, 1 asterisk. So that is, you want to see if, for instance, there is a 0 misplaced somewhere. So if you find that there's a 0 or 1 misplaced, then you immediately reject, and that's it. So we'll come to this analysis later. Forget these blue things here, we just look at the algorithm itself. So that's the first step of the algorithm. It's just checks. And now we enter a for loop here, and this for loop is basically I run it until I just see at least a 1, a 0, and a 1. And then within the body of this loop, what I do is I cross, so I scan the tape, and basically I cross the zeros. Every time I see a first 0, I cross with an X, and every time I see a 1, I also cross with an X. And then I just continue doing this process until everything is marked by an X. And then once I finish this loop, I then go to the tape and basically I check if I only have X's, and then I accept or reject. Okay? Now, it's a very naive algorithm, and let's just try to understand what is the time complexity involved in understanding or checking if this particular string belongs to this language. So, the first part of the algorithm, which is just scanning through, it forces me to scan the whole tape. And if I scan the whole tape, and the input string is of size n, then basically what I'll do is I'll take the configuration, the number of configuration in that Turing machine, basically would be n steps to scan the whole input tape. Okay? And then to actually reposition it back to the left of the tape. So in total, what I get is n steps, so 2 times n steps in total. Okay? But remember back again to our large, our own notation of Landau, we don't care about the constants, then these constants don't care because we're just looking at asymptotic values, then this part of this algorithm is just linear, O to the n. Okay? Now let's go into the body of the loop, and again, if I do this scanning and crossing axes for zeros, and every 0 is every 1 that I see, again, I might take an order n. Now I say here that I scan all the way to, so I say here actually the same as this order to n, but this I just put it like the worst case scenario, which is if I basically scan all the way to the blanks. Okay? But this is not generally true because I don't need to really scan all the way to the blanks, so this can actually become very efficient. But anyway, we know that the minimal computation taken for whatever code that you come up, it will always be less, so it will always be bounded by linear. So in the end of the day, what you get is also linear computation there. Okay. Now, the loop, because I'm taking strings, so this is a string of n, size n, and because I'm marking every time, I'm marking 2 x's, one for the 0 and one for the 1, that means then every time I do this loop, so I'll do this loop for n over 2. Right? So the total time taken to actually compute this guy is, say, the time taken to run this particular body times the number it runs this repeat. So the whole loop might take n over 2 times the order, which is the body of this loop, and here I just multiply the coefficients and I ignore, times the n, I ignore the coefficients, and this guy basically takes order n squared, so it's polynomial time. Okay? And in the end, what I have to do when I do this kind of analysis, basically I sum all these orders, and in this case I take order n plus order, say, n squared and so on, all these sums, and then I just take the higher order term because I just want asymptotic values, and then I get O n squared algorithm. Now you see that this type of analysis that typically you have to do when you're actually coming up with efficient code, the time profiler code that I showed you in the beginning does not do this analysis. This is where the intelligence comes. That is, how do I change this code in such a way that I improve these measures? And a time profiler will never tell you this information. So part is you have to do some kind of mathematical analysis, coming up and improving with a new algorithm, but the timer profilers, codes out there, can assist you with where the code has to be improved. Okay? So now we've seen a very, very naive algorithm to pass a context-free grammar that takes, so we've proved that there exists a particular code that is able to process this language, but in polynomial time. Okay? Square. And the question is, can we actually improve this code to actually reduce this n squared, say to n log n, for instance, as we'll see. And indeed, you can improve this code, and let's just look at one particular improvement. So what I'm going to do with this code to show that where your intelligence in the future, if you are to develop codes, comes is how you think about a particular problem is look at, so I'll keep all these the same, so I'll keep all these lines of code the same. This one, so the loop, and that one. The only thing I'm going to change is the body of the loop. And this is sometimes where you can actually gain a lot of efficiency, is looking at analyzing how you do the body of a particular loop in an algorithm. Okay? So I'll keep everything the same except the body. As I said, so what I will change now is I'll keep everything the same, now the body has changed. And now let's just look at the body that I've changed. So I do exactly the same, and all I do now, I decide to do the following. So I scan the tape to simply see if the number of zeros plus the number of ones is odd or even. So I decided to do that because what I noticed from this language is that what I noticed from this language is that I've got O to the k and 1 to the k. And because I'm expecting equal numbers of zeros and equal numbers of 1, then that means I have to have 2k symbols that is even. So if I sum the number of zeros and the number of ones, I must have even numbers of this sum. Okay? So that's the first thing I noticed. So I'll try to follow this path. And now if it's odd immediately, then you reject. So if this quantity is odd, then you immediately reject, and otherwise you go to the next step, and what you're going to do now is cross off every other 0 with an x, and also cross off every other 1 with an x. So that's all I've changed in the code. And let's try to understand how can I improve the previous code. So the first thing to notice is that this guy here, the scan tape, and adding zeros and 1 to check if it's odd and even, we know that, you've seen that with Giovanni, is that you can easily implement this part of the code with a deterministic finite state machine. Now that's a lesson because sometimes you guys, typically when you code, you actually use very complicated solutions instead of using these lower classes of computations that are actually linear or polynomial time. Okay? And at this stage here, typically if you were to code, now it's easy. Now as a computer scientist, it's easy for you to recognize parts of the code that can be easily translated to a, say, final state machine. And there, where you recognize it's a final state machine, just plug it in, and the machine will, and the whole algorithm effectively will become faster. Okay? So we know that this part of the code can actually run by a DFA, then you put immediately a DFA, and we know that a DFA minimally runs on order n. Now, this part here, which is just the reject, is just order 1, so it doesn't really depend on the input. So whatever the input it is, so it's not really, it's completely irrelevant here. Now, let's look at this guy here. Scanning and crossing, we know that takes order n, but now what we want to understand is how long this loop takes, how fast this loop actually takes. And to do that, let's try to reanimate what is going on here. Okay? So this quantity here is on, and let's try to understand why that is the case. So imagine, again I apologize that this is should be a slightly shifted, but anyway, that's the input tape, and that's the first 0 that I have, and that's the input string that I actually put into my system. And then I want to run according to the algorithm, which is the body. The body of the algorithm is actually stated there. So what I'm going to do, as I said, is I'm going to cross every other 0. So I see a 0, I cross an x, I put an x, sorry. I see a 0, I put an x, and I'm going to cross with an x every other 0. So I cross this guy, that guy, and so on. And I do exactly the same, so I put the x's as here, and then for the 1s, I do exactly the same. I cross every other x's up until the final step. So that's the first step, and I go through the next loop, and I do exactly the same. So for every x, I just maintain as it was, so that's why I just put it not to confuse. And now I see every other 0, so I see a 0, every other 0 I mark, every other 0 I mark, and then I leave that alone, and I do exactly the same for 1. Every other 1 I mark, every other mark, and so on. And I do this process until I reach the final stage, which is step 4. And I actually remain with just x's there. And now what you will notice with this process, so every time you're doing this, and now you're checking if the number of zeros plus 1 with your DFA, you're checking if this is actually odd or even. So every time, the step. Now let's try to count the number of steps taken here, but in terms of the input size. Okay? So what you'll notice here, so the better way to look at it is actually going from this level upwards, and then we can analyze the back step. So you'll notice that if you start with, say, a 1x, as you go upwards, we actually go by a factor of 2. So the number of x's grow by a factor of 2. This example is not so nice, but easier to see it is with a, say, 8 zeros. Let's just look at 8 zeros, and you'll see that that's the case, and then you can easily quantify 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So as I said, so what we do is we cross every other x. So we do x, 0x, 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 and 0. And then if I do the same every other 0, so this guy's x, 0. So every other 0, this is confusing. That. And then finally, and then in the end, like that. And now if you try to quantify the number of steps, so your input was this guy here, and now what you want to do is quantify in terms of what's going on. And what you realize, sorry, I did something wrong here. It's x, x, x. have to check this correctly. So, but if you do this algorithm, what you realize is that the factor of 2, so the number of x's that go here is actually a factor of 2. So you start off with 2 to the 0. So I'll double check that again here, but I'll do that. So you actually grow by a factor of 1, 2, and so on, all the way to n steps. So the number of x's plus, yeah, exactly, sorry. So I'm the one who's confused. So this is fine. So here you check, that's just 1. And then here you see that the factor here increases by a factor of 2. And here, so here you've got 1x. And here you get 2 x's. And here you get 4 x's, right? So the time that you take here is actually 1 plus 2 the number of x's. Yeah? Now, if you do the inverse process from going from this input tape all the way to down, then it's just the inverse of this operation, which is the log algorithm. So this basically is log of 2. So in the end, what you get is 1 log of n, but on the base power of 2. But n now will be basically the number of input that you have there for zeros. Okay? And if you do this, now if you go back again to the basically to the body of the algorithm, now you can say that the time that this loop takes is simply 1 plus log n, and now you can multiply the number of times that this loop actually executes with what is actually within the body. So what you do basically is just multiply the order of the body times the order that the algorithm takes to loop, and then in the end what you get is an n log n algorithm. And then you see immediately that you actually have reduced this algorithm from a polynomial which was here, n squared, all the way to this guy by just changing the body of the loop. Okay? So that's just the message that you guys, by just having a nice practice of coding, you can actually change the execution time. Okay? Now, in general, there's a proof, I won't go into details. There's a general proof that says that every context-free language, so any language that you can actually imagine that is within context-free formalism, there's actually a proof that says you can actually find, there's always an algorithm called, using this idea of dynamic programming. I won't go into details, but it turns out to be that every context-free grammar can be basically passed within n cubed. And that's really nice, and this is actually a statement. So now we understand that regular languages, the minimal time run for them is linear, and the maximum for context-free grammar is actually n cubed. And that's really nice, and this is why compilers exist. That is, you can actually, so the majority of the languages out there are actually context-free languages, and then that's why compilers can actually execute in very fast time. So these are the ranges that you actually have been working on, okay? Majority. Okay, so let's go to the next stage, which is trying to understand this relationship between P and P space algorithm. So we understand that, NP, P problems, and now we go into a larger set, which is the polynomial space algorithms, okay? And we want to understand the relationship between these two. So suppose you've come up with an algorithm, and if you realize that basically it uses ON squared space, that is, suppose I even put here the example, I believe. So suppose you've got an input size of 10. So this is the tape, and then as you run it, basically takes, say, 100 steps. Okay? And you run for different n inputs, and the order maintains. Okay? So O n squared. And what we want to understand is, if I run this machine that is actually using this tape, sorry. So the size is 10, and as it uses not steps, but basically the space that it uses is actually a memory size of 100. Okay? So it starts with 10, but then it ends up using 100 cells. Okay? And what I want to understand is, if I run this system, how long does it run? Okay? So now, what we're going to see is that this kind of algorithm, which is p space, is bounded by two limits. So on one hand, you can imagine that if you have these 100 cells being used, that means that a Turing machine that is going to use this guy, in the minimal, basically will have to visit all these cells at a particular time. So the minimal time that it takes is actually on the same order of the space that you have there. So the minimal that it will run as the system, because all the transitions that you observe, it will be within the order, so the time for this guy will be on the order O n squared. Yeah. But nothing tells you that as it goes, as this p space runs, as this algorithm runs, it might even visit a particular cell multiple times. Yeah? In fact, could be huge. And the question is, what is, so up until now we know that p space is actually a larger set than p time, p space. But then the question is, what is the time here? What is the maximum bound that you can have for p space algorithm? And in principle, you could say, oh, how do I know? I could run this guy and visit this cell an infinite amount of time. That means that the time that I will have here, in principle, is infinite. Okay? For p space algorithm. And we'll see now that that's not the case. That is, once you bound space, then you can actually bound time as well. Okay? And let's try to understand that. So suppose again, back again to our p space algorithm, that is O n squared. O n squared. And what we want to understand is, for how long, what is the maximum time that I can run this algorithm? So suppose I've got, say, an input size, so this is the space that I use in my algorithm, and I want to quantify how long my algorithm will run if I've got this memory installed in my computer. Okay? So let's suppose that my machine, my Turing machine, has, to simplify the calculation just so that you understand that we can bound also, once you bound space, you also bound time. So suppose that my Turing machine has 3 states, and 2 symbols. And let's see what are the number of configurations that I can have in my machine. Okay? So again, so suppose I've got, just to simplify this with one example, suppose but the memory that I have installed in my computer has these 100 cells. Okay? And now you want to quantify time. So let's try to, first of all, see the number of configurations that you can have in the machine. So the first thing that you notice is that because I've got 2 symbols, in each of these cells, I can have 2 options. I can have either, so the tape configurations in each of these cells can either be 0 or 1, and so forth, up until my, say, 100 cells. So the tape configuration, the number of, say, possible configurations that I can have there is 2 to the power of 100, right? Tape configurations. And on top of that, once I've set up my, say, tape configuration, we know that the system can be in either the 3 states. So maybe I should write it here such that you see what's going on. So I'm trying to define the configuration of the machine. So this is the configuration. So I know that it has, say, 100 cells in my system. And I know that in this here, I can either have a 0 or 1. In there, I can have a 0 or 1. And so forth, all the way to this point there. That means that all these combinations, I generate a 2 to the power of 10, 2 to the power, 100 tape configurations. But on the other hand, I know that for every tape configuration, I can have say, the head of the machine in a particular state, in a particular cell, but on top of that, I can have a particular state, Q, J, say, let's put it this way. And what I'm trying to quantify is exactly that. I'm just going to multiply, say, the tape configurations times the number of states that I have, plus all these positions where the head can be. And the positions of the head, basically, is related to the size of this memory cell. And if I quantify, then I get this huge number here, which is actually exponential time. So you'll see that to run a bounded, so if you put a bound memory, so the number of configurations that your machine will actually run, so you start with configuration 1 all the way to n, where n is exactly this value here, which is a huge number, okay? So in general, you can actually put there, in general, you have the number of states times the number of symbols, which is k to the power Sn, where Sn is basically the size of this memory that you have there, times the Sn, which is the number of positions that the head can actually visit all through. And you see that this number is very huge, it's actually exponential, but it's not infinite. So what this is actually telling you is that once you bound memory in your computer, you can actually determine what is the maximum running time of your algorithm. And typically it will be actually an exponential because of that particular factor there. Okay? Now, what happens is that if you put an infinite memory, which does not exist physically, this is a typically undecidable problem. It's impossible to determine when this problem or this algorithm will actually terminate. So it's really undecidable. But there's no question of undecidability if you have, say, finite memory. So the key point is the following. So if you start with configuration 1, and now, because you have this measure, so you've put finite memory inside your system, so you can run your algorithm, and your algorithm can go all the way to Cn, where Cn is this value that we've calculated. So that will be this exponential time. And if you still observe that your algorithm is still running past that exponential time, then that means your algorithm is actually closed in a loop. So it basically goes to this. So this is all possible configurations that you can generate, but once it reaches Cn, and if you still observe that your algorithm is still running, then something is wrong within your algorithm. So it's actually having a loop within all possible configurations. So it basically is going back again, and so forth, and so forth. Okay. So indeed so the relationship that we find is that P space is contained within exponential time, but there's no problem about infinity here, so it's actually bounded. An example of a P space algorithm is, for instance, chess games, right? Chess games, these actually generate very huge, incur a lot of space when you're trying to solve these kind of problems. Another example here is like, for instance, suppose you've got two, so this is a game played between two players, and where, so you've got a list, typically you've got a list or a dictionary of valid words, in this particular case it's geographic places, and what what you have to do is basically player 1 basically starts off with a particular city, and the last symbol of that particular city means that the second player has to actually come up with another name of the city that starts, in this case, with D, and so on. And if this guy ends with R, so the next player has to find another word that starts with R, and so on. And the question is, depending on this list that exists, but of course the player does not actually observe the list. This is actually being played on a computer, and the question is, given the dictionary, can the first player win if he chooses carefully? So once he chooses this first city, can basically this decide the outcome of the game? Okay? And this actually generates a p-space algorithm, and typically leads to a search space that is actually huge. And this is actually what is typically known as the min-max search algorithm used in artificial intelligence. So the idea is the following. So imagine you've got here, this is actually the game tree, not the computational history in terms of non-deterministic machine, but this is just really the algorithm itself, okay? And this is what is known as the min-max algorithm. So the idea of the min-max algorithm is actually to generate an algorithm in such a way that it maximizes my win and minimizes the win of the opponent. So the idea is that at one of the level of this game tree, there must be a guess. I guess the possible games that can actually lead me to actually win this particular game. And then for the next level, then the opponent basically generates, so in this case it's actually the computer who's actually generating these possible moves, but basically these moves would be the opponent's best possible choices, such that he could try to win my game. And it turns out to be that for the guessing part, as we saw, because non-deterministic machines basically is based on these non-deterministic trees, so for this stage, I could use a non-deterministic, for my side of the problem, I can use a non-deterministic machine, say quantum computer or parallel processing, to actually decide what would be my best play. So this is actually used in chess games, okay? So they use at this level, say, parallel processing. But it turns out to be, for the opponent's side of the game, it's just impossible. You cannot use non-deterministic. You simply have to actually do a huge search space in order to minimize the opponent's game. And in this case, what happens is that because I'm generating so many possibilities, this is actually generating an exponential space. It actually explodes so as I go forward, actually, the whole tree just becomes huge exponential, right? So in fact, it's actually an exponential space algorithm, but a way to trim this search space, and what people typically do, is actually do a search breadth first. So basically, they actually look at level. So you cannot store the whole tree. You just actually search level by level, and in this case, you can actually come down to a p-space algorithm. So the search space can actually be reduced from, say, exponential to polynomial space. Okay, that's one example. So finally, before we go to the next, so now we're going back again to this Hamiltonian problem, which was to understand these NP non-polynomial time algorithms and trying to understand what happens. So the question now we're coming closer to this question is there an intelligent way? So let's forget everything, but let's try to understand, is there an intelligent way to transform non-deterministic polynomial algorithms in such a way to polynomial time algorithms, but without exploding time? And so far, no one has really found the solution. So it seems to be the case that we always have to do this search. And let's try to understand this search that typically you see in proofs out there, but no one has really overcome this problem because we always end up with this algorithm, so to speak. So let's go back again to our Hamiltonian problem, which is given a graph and 2 nodes. Can you find a path that goes through all these nodes by just visiting once every other all the nodes? Yeah. And if I give the same, say the same location, then it actually forms a loop in the graph. And as we saw, this is not a polynomial, but is actually an NP problem. Okay? And let's assume that you have an non-deterministic algorithm that actually runs this Hamiltonian problem, and it runs on Tm time. So this is the time that it actually runs on. Okay? An example of the use of this Hamiltonian problem is, for instance, if you have to, say, imagine you have got a person who actually wants to deliver goods in a local area. Say, I don't know, the milkman that wants to deliver milk into several houses, and the idea is to find the shortest path that goes through all these houses by just visiting them once and returning back to base. Yeah. So that's one particular application of it. And in this particular case, the shortest path, if we use a naive non-deterministic algorithm, we see that the shortest path is actually the one that I've already marked here in red, and that takes you this 167 minutes. It's not important. And the search algorithm is very naive. I don't want to bother you with that. But the key point is the following, is that depending on the location, the number of nodes that you have, the number of possibilities and searches that you have, this explodes tremendously. So if you have 5 nodes, then it's 5 factorial, which is 120. But if you have 10 locations, then the search space is quite dramatic. It just explodes exponentially. So in parallel processing and quantum computers, this is fine, but now if you want to run on it on a polynomial time algorithm that is a deterministic Turing machine, then that's a problem. And let's try to quantify that. So suppose let's try to transform an NP problem into a P problem. So in general, as we saw, that the search tree of a non-deterministic machine is actually something like that. So it starts with one configuration, and then for the next level, it generates the next options of configurations, right? And so on. So it branches off until it finds a halting configuration. So that's general for an NP problem. And what we want to do is try to convert this, try to run this into a polynomial, so a deterministic Turing machine. So now let's just assume that at every level, the maximum, say, configuration and choices that you generate is 4. So for instance, here I start with configuration 1, and then if I lead to the next branch, then what I have is just 4 possibilities, and so on. So it's always maximum bounded by 4, just to make it easy. Okay? And the way I'm going to run this deterministic system is by basically doing a breadth first search. So basically I generate these possibilities, and then I run through these possibilities to try to check if it's the end state, if it's the hard state or not. And the way typically what people do is transform this thing into the following. So they take a Turing machine, they divide the memory into different parts. So the memory is then divided into a part that contains the input. In the case of the Hamiltonian graph, that will be just the nodes, the graph, and the input, so the initial node and the final node. And then tape 2 will generate this tree somehow. Well, not the whole tree, but it will generate the options at every level, the configurations at every level. And the third tape, I'm going to do something very similar to a universal Turing machine. That is, I'm going to run my NP problem for that particular configuration. Okay? So in the first step, what I'm going to do, this machine now that is now taking over, this deterministic machine that is now running this kind of tape, what it does is generates the first level of the tree. So it puts all the levels of the tree here. In this case, for this particular example, is basically C1, C2, up until C4. These are the possible configurations of the non-deterministic machine. So basically it knows how to generate that. It generates this gap and places in tape 2. Now, what's the next step is that it's going to do this in a for loop now. Basically, it's going to try to run this machine M on all those configurations, C1, C2, C3, and C4, and try to see if this is the hard state or not. Now, if it's not the hard state, then it generates the next level. So it runs all these configurations, and if it's not the hard state, then it generates all these configurations and places again in tape 2. And then again, it simulates the NP problem on those configurations, and so on. Now, if you do the analysis with Pico, typically, this is the typical analysis this occurs, is that in step 1, for the step 1, what you have is that you've got 4 possibilities, 4 possible configurations that you generate, that you place in tape 2, and for the next step, you generate the next possible configurations. That is, so here I generate 1, 2, 3, 4, and then for the next step, I basically have 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, and so on. 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, and so on. And I'm going to execute these configurations. And I know that it's bounded by maximal 4 possible configurations. I know that. Just to make it simple, just for you to see what happens here. And so again, for the first step, I generate this configuration, 4 possible choices. For the next step, I have, say, 4 times 4 configurations. And then if I move on until step Tm, which I know this is the halting time of the non-deterministic machine, this is my final step in this tree, I know that I generate 4 to the Tm possibilities. So basically the time of this thing just explodes immediately. Okay? So the search time really explodes. So again, because I'm generating all these possible trees, I know that I'm generating all these possibilities, but for all these possibilities, the P problem is running this non-deterministic polynomial machine, and basically, in the end, what the time that I incur is actually exponential time. That is, I have all these 4 possibilities, 4 to the Tm possibilities, timing the running time of the non-deterministic machine, that is bounded by this actually, and this basically incurs a huge amount of time. So it seems to be the case that every time that we have an NP problem, you have to do a huge search space, and the search space is just huge. I mean, it's really huge. And the question is there an efficient way to actually reduce this time? And that's where the big money is, which so in the end of the day, what we know is that, so I'll just skip this because I think there's a lot of details that you can actually look at this later. We'll skip this. So the question we'll see now in a video is, how do we come up, is there a strategy to overcome this limitation? That is there a way to actually bring down this number down? And just before we finish that, to show you a video, I just wanted to show one thing that we did not look was the following thing. That is, in this diagram we've seen P space, but I did not actually mention the NP space. And it turns out to be that it has been already proven that NP space is the same as P space. And this was proven by a guy called Savage, and it's called the Savage theorem. And basically the theorem basically says that if you transform, you can basically transform, say, an NP space algorithm to a P space, and the order remains virtually the same. So again, so here, very informally, so if you have a non-deterministic machine that uses, say, a space algorithm, and if you transform this P space, NP space algorithm into a P space, then basically at most, you just get squared space of that algorithm. So if you start with a linear or a polynomial, you stay within a polynomial time algorithm, and that's really nice. So this has been already proven, so there are nice ways to transform that. But now the big question is, can you do the same for the time? So we can do for the space, but now the question is, can you do for, which is the big question, is can you actually transform, say, an NP into a P problem without exploding this time? And this is basically, Arc for Grams is $1 million prize, which is put up by the Clay Millennium Problems, and is it's really an open problem, and we're going to see this video right now, which explains very nicely this problem. So let's.
Serafim, if you want, I have the video.
I have it
on the archive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah, that would be nice, faster. So this is a really nice video and explains very, very, very well this idea. And the question is, we should not give hopes. Maybe there's a way to do it without doing this search. Okay? And
there's certain kinds of problems that seem to take a long time. And it's not really well understood why that is. So we're going to explore that. We'll start off with something simple. Let's take the problem 7 times 13. That's an example of something we call multiplication. Just for, if you're just getting up to speed, the answer is 91. If you look at the reverse problem, given the product, 91, and you want to try to find the two numbers that multiply together to give that result, those are called the factors of 91. You can either do that by remembering the previous slide, or you can just start out with the number 91 and figure out what those factors are directly. See, 7 times 13 gives you 91. Now, let's look at a slightly bigger example. Now, probably this is one that you're not going to do in your head if you're a normal person. But if you fed it into a computer, you would get the answer out. And what's amazing is that the answer would come out in a split second. But let's take a look at something more interesting. What happens if you look at the reverse problem, the factoring problem, for that particular product? Well, we already know what the answer is, but suppose you didn't write it down from the previous slide. You just went directly from this product here in blue to and you wanted to figure out what the two factors were. So that's something you could solve on a computer, and actually somebody went ahead and did that. But the difference between this problem and the previous one is that it takes a little longer. In fact, it was 20 computer years of effort required to solve this problem. Now you may ask, why would somebody care and put all that effort in? Well, for one thing, we're mathematicians, and, because it's there. Another reason is somebody paid them $20,000 to do that, believe it or not. This is true. And you may think, well, why would somebody pay $20,000 to factor a number? And how can we get a piece of that? Well, you can. Here's another number. $30,000 in fact. No one knows no one knows the factors of this problem. So if you want to turn on your computers and want to spend, it's going to be more than, this is the bigger number. This is the bigger number than the previous one. It's going to be more than 20 computer years, probably a lot more. But you can earn $30,000 that way. Now, why in the world is somebody spending that kind of money to factor numbers? Well, this is actually comes from this company called RSA. And you can just Google it if you Google, the RSA factoring challenge, you will find that you'll find this number, the previous number, and a whole list of other numbers, which are $50,000, $100,000, $200,000. This is all true. And the reason why the RSA company is spending that kind of money to factor numbers is not so much because they're interested in that kind of factorization, but they're interested in just getting a handle on the progress that people are making in factoring numbers. Because factoring is essential to their business. They're in the business of cryptography, designing secret codes for secure communication between computers. And the kind of code that they use is called the RSA code, is really based on factoring. So if somebody figures a way of factoring quickly, it will break their code. That's something they want to know about, obviously. So that's why RSA is interested in factoring. Now, the question is, why is factoring so hard to solve? Why does factoring take such a long time to solve on a computer? Well, the reason for that is, in contrast with multiplication, where you can kind of zoom right in on the answer, in factoring, all we know how to do is to search for the answer. Given your number that you want to factor, you try dividing by 2, by 3. You can confine yourself just to the prime numbers to save yourself a little bit of time anyway. And you try, dividing by 5, 7. If at any point you find one of those numbers that divide evenly into the number you're trying to factor, then you've got to factor, and you can stop there. But otherwise, you just have to keep going on and on and on. The number of possible factors that you might have to search through for factorization problems of the sort I just described is absolutely astronomical. And that's why it takes even super fast computers a very long time to solve that problem. So the process of searching for the answer over a large space of possibilities, kind of one by one in a mindless way, is we call brute force search. And that process is very slow if you have a lot of possibilities that you need to search them. Now the interesting question here is, do you really need to search? Or is there some way of solving, say, the factoring problem that zooms in on the answer without searching? That would be amazing. And in fact, we don't know the answer to that question. Seems like factoring needs searching, at least as far as we know. I mean, you can do some things that are some improvements on the simple-minded method that I gave you and cut down the search space somewhat. But the only procedures that we know still involve searching for a lot of possibilities. We don't know if you can eliminate that or not. But let's turn to another example. Here's an example I call the clique problem. So given a network here of nodes, and nodes are little circles and lines, which might represent something else. Say, for example, the nodes might represent the members of the math department at MIT. Okay, and we'll draw a line. I'll leave off the name. We'll draw a line connecting two nodes if those two faculty members are friends. Okay, so you can see we have a pretty friendly department, more or less. And what I'm interested in doing, sometimes we'll host parties now and then, and you'd like to invite people over to your home who are all mutual friends of one another. Okay, so a group of people who are all connected, or a group of nodes who are all connected by lines with one another is called a clique. So over here we have a 3 clique, it's a 4 clique, 4 nodes all connected by lines, and so on. And what I'm interested in doing is finding among the faculty, among these nodes, groups which form cliques, presumably as large as I can get, so I can have a decent-sized party. So, over here I got a 3 clique. Down here, I got a 4 clique. Question is that the best I can do, or maybe can I find a bigger clique than that? Well, if you're really quick, you can see that, in fact, there is a 5 clique in this graph. Here it is maybe a little more clearly. But the point is that if you want to try to find a clique, say in a bigger graph, here's a graph with even more, here's a network or graph with even more nodes, the number of possibilities, say, if you want to look for a clique, say, of 8 nodes in here. That's not a clique, but if you sort of want to try to find one, perhaps with 8 nodes in it, you just have to, as far as we know, you have to search through all possible subsets of 8 nodes to see if any one of them turns out to be a clique. And the number of possibilities that you would have to go through to do that is large. And in fact, if you had, instead of just 100 nodes, as I described here, if you had hundreds of nodes, it's still a pretty modest-sized problem, and you try to find the biggest clique possible, or some target-sized clique of a reasonably decent size, it would take centuries, maybe even millennia, of computer time to search through all the possibilities. You see, it's a very similar kind of situation with factoring, and it's even more similar in that you can ask the same question. Do you really need to search? Or is there some way to zoom in on that big clique quickly without searching? We don't know. So both the clique and the factoring problem are examples of what I would call needle in the haystack problem. In case you're familiar with haystack, here's an example. Big pile of hay, and somewhere in there is a needle. To search for that needle, if you can imagine, it's going to take a long time. Here's a cartoon sort of giving the idea. Somebody actually found the needle after searching. So, anything we can find on the internet these days. In the case of, the sort of example of looking for a needle in a haystack, here's on my model of a haystack. If you want to, you can ask the problem, is searching necessary to find the needle? Well, perhaps you have a magnet. Then, bingo, you get the needle right away. You don't have to search at all. So the question that we're asking in the case of factoring and clique, is there some kind of mathematical analog to the magnet that pulls out the answer without having to search for it? Neither of those cases do we know. And in fact, that phenomenon is very, very pervasive. It's very widespread throughout problems in engineering, in economics, in optimization, in science. For example, if you're looking at problems involving scheduling classes or exams, where you're trying to minimize the number of conflicts, the only way to do that, which finds the best possible answer, involves searching large numbers of schedules. Or if you want to color a map with the smallest number of colors so that no two adjacent countries end up with the same color, you might have to search through a lot of possible colorings in order to find the one that's the best possible. Or if there's a problem in computational biology where you're given a protein sequence and you're trying to find the configuration that sequence will fold up into to give you a sense of the function of that protein inside the cell. It would be great if we could solve that on a computer, but the only way that we know how to do it would involve trying to search through all possible configurations of the protein. It takes too long. This is a real practical problem that people would love to be able to solve. It's just beyond our computational ability to solve it by searching, and no one knows that there's a faster way. Another problem of interest to mathematicians is the problem of theorem proving. It's another searching type problem. If I want to know, is there a proof of a theorem of a certain length? So, I've given some mathematical statement, say, and I want to know, is there a proof, which is at most 100 pages? Well, I can do that in principle by a computer. I can make that check by computer by searching through every possible proof of 100 pages long and seeing if any one of them actually works. But of course, that's going to take a horrendous amount of time. Is there some way to find that proof more directly? No one knows. It would seem incredible if there was, but we don't know. We don't have a proof that it is. And it goes on and on. There are many other problems of this kind where searching seems to be necessary, but we don't have a proof that it really is. So that's the P versus NP question. Sort of informally speaking, can we solve searching problems without searching? Okay, I'll say more about that in a second, but let me first help you see or explain where the terminology P versus NP comes from. comes from these two classes of problems called P and NP. P stands for the problems that you can solve quickly, the so-called polynomial time problems. And I don't want to get too technical about it, but for our point of view, polynomial time, where you're considering how long the procedure is going to run in terms of the length of the input to the procedure, and it only grows by a polynomial number of steps, compared with an exponential number of steps, which is what you need if you had a searching problem.
Are we actually thinking correctly as computer scientists, like doing all this search? Is it really the only way to do it? Is there this analogy with the magnet analogy? Is a very nice one, and we're just going to look at one example here, which is with the prime numbers. And indeed, in some cases, you can actually find this idea of magnet. But for the general case, the question is still open. But if you find this example, so that we'll just show this example, and then we'll just close this up, and then you can actually look at this video, the rest of the video at home. But the analogy that it's going to give here, I mean, the example that it's going to give with the prime numbers is a very, very nice example. And then the quest to find something similar, like the prime numbers, is really, really interesting. And in fact, you guys could become a millionaire without, working ever again. So if you find this solution. So this is what we're interested in, is actually having you guys, because you've got, fresh minds and so on, you can now come with new solutions to this kind of problems. So this is what we're interested in, in general, the world. So if you actually forward to the prime numbers,
and believe it or not,
that would be nice.
I get, a couple of times a year, I get a manuscript of someone purporting to solve the P versus NP question.
I think it's further.
For some reason, I
Yeah.
I get sent these things. I don't know why. They flavor comeback. So rest.
Yeah, here. This is no. Yeah, that's the one.
What I want to show you, where you might think you would otherwise need.
Yeah, that's fine, I think.
And I'm not going to be able to do that in detail because we get too technical, but I want to give you a little bit of a flavor of how that might happen. And that's the case of testing whether a number is prime.
Yeah.
Okay? So this is actually one of the problems that, the problem that Gödel mentioned in his letter, as one that might seem to require searching, and superficially the way you would test if a number is prime is the same way you would factor a number. You would do trial division of lots of possibilities, and if you fail to find a factor, then you know the number is prime. If you find a factor, you know it's not prime. But that's very slow, as I pointed out, that searching type method. But we now know that there are dramatically faster ways of testing if a number is prime. And a little flavor of how that goes. And these all sort of rest on a centuries-old theorem due to Fermat in number theory. And this is as technical as the talk is going to get. So I would say this is as technical as I'm going to get my my laptop here, because I know you can't see. This is a okay, let me walk you through this. I mean, it's worth trying to understand this because it's very nice. So try to bear with me. What this theorem says is that if you have a prime number, P, like take 7 for example, and you have a natural number A less than P, like take 2 for example, so P equal to 7 and A equal to 2. And if you raise A to the P minus 1 power, you always get 1 modulo P. And saying that in English, it says that if you take the number A, which is 2 in our example, you raise it to the P minus 1 power, then you divide by P and take the remainder. So throw away the quotient, but only look at the remainder after you do the division. You always get 1 for the remainder. So let's actually walk ourselves through an example. So if P is 7 and A is 2, as I mentioned, you raise 2, which is A, to the 7 minus 1, or 6 power, which is 61. Now you divide by 7 and take the remainder. Now 63 is the multiple of 7. So 64 has a remainder 1. When you divide by 7, it works. Okay, and it works whenever you meet the conditions of the theorem. For any prime in any A, and any such A, you always want to get 1. But it's actually kind of, so you might think big deal, but it's kind of amazing that this works if you actually try it out in a bunch of examples. And just in contrast, if you try an example where P is not prime, you'll see it fails to work. So if you take P equal to 15 and A equal to 2, then you raise 2 to the 14th power. You get 16,384, and you divide by 15. You take the remainder, you get 4, which is not 1. So you see that equation fails in the case where it can fail anyway, in the case where P is not prime. And what's amazing about this is that that calculation that I just did proves to you that 15 isn't prime. Of course, we knew that already. But this proves it to you in a different way. It doesn't prove it to you by exhibiting the factors, 3 times 5, P. It proves it to you by saying, well, P fails to have a property that we know prime numbers have, and therefore it can't be prime. And the thing is that you can use this as the basis of a test, basis of an algorithm, which can test primality without going through the factorization process. And in fact, initially it was a randomized algorithm, and since, since sort of, with lots of additional ideas, it's been made into a deterministic algorithm. And now we know that the problem of testing the number of primes can be solved quickly in polynomial time. Okay, so searching can be eliminated. Okay. Now let me tell you a little bit about this.
So you can watch. So we'll just stop there. I think we're just running out of time, and you can watch the rest of the video. Actually, it's a very nice video. But again, so with this prime number case, again, it's very similar to the NP problem in the sense that typically people were doing a lot of searches. But in the end, someone came up with a mathematical theorem or mathematical equation that basically tests for these prime numbers, and you can basically execute in very fast time. And this again is related to the initial concept that I was telling you about the homograph complexity. So given a data, or given a problem, or given a language, the question is, how do you address that data? Do you really have to do all these algorithms that you've been learning, that is the search and things like that? And if you think correctly as a scientist or as a computer scientist, the question has to always be in the back of your mind, not just, I'm just going to code if, then, for loops and so on. This doesn't really solve any very, significant problems. The question is, can you actually come up with, say, a mathematical formalism that essentially decodes that data in some sense and actually can represent that huge data set in such a way that you can actually test just like in a matter of a second. So instead of doing, so the question then there is, can you actually transform in general an NP problem to a P problem without actually doing all this search? Right? And that's a huge problem. And whoever solves this problem will be basically upheld there together with Alan Turing. So I hope you get motivated with that kind of problem. Yeah, thank you for today.